Thanks a lot for the very kind words. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And in this most fantastic port city, and I don't say this to be kind or to flatter you, because I have hard facts to prove this. Because back in 2007, I wrote a travel guide about the 3 biggest port cities in Europe, Antwerp, Hamburg, and Rotterdam. So I spent a lot of time here, and I brought one copy of it for Professor Preuls as a present. The only thing, it's from 2007, so I cannot guarantee that all the recommendations on the facilities of the Reeperbahn are still okay, but you will have to check for yourself, I think. It's a special day also for another reason to me, because at this very moment, as we speak, the Belgian Parliament is supposed to be voting on the new Belgian shipping code. This is a project that I started 12 years ago, so it took a serious part of my life. And we worked with the Commission for the government on this draft. Erik Franks was also a member of our commission. So, and normally today this shipping code will be voted in the parliament. So Erik, I will let you know this evening what happens. So I have a presentation, ladies and gentlemen, on the green aspects of ports. This is, of course, an extremely broad topic. And for that reason, I made a bit of a selection. And you all know that ports and the environment are a very difficult marriage. Also, the public image of the shipping sector and of the port sector among the general public is not always that nice. The general public and the media are interested when there is a calamity, an environmental disaster. And I have brought you also some pictures about what is happening in my own port city, Antwerp, and I have to correct one thing here, maybe not so kind to Hamburg. It is Antwerp that is the second biggest port in Europe, not Hamburg. And this is the case both in terms of total traffic volume, but also in terms of containers. And 10 years ago it was different, and then it was Rotterdam, Hamburg, Antwerp, and for several reasons, also due to environmental law issues, it's now different. Antwerp is the second one and Hamburg is the third one. And I know in Hamburg you had this problem of the deepening of the river Elbe. There were a lot of environmental law issues there, and also recently new problems in relation to public procurement, the designation of the dredging company. But also in Antwerp we have big issues relating to environmental law. And this is some kind of logo that is used by a campaign group, local residents who campaign against every new attempt at developing the port of Antwerp. And I don't have to translate this for German people. Stop the waanzin, stop the madness in English. And it's written in blood, as you can see. I'll try to find my pointer. Yes, it's in blood. And this is the big ship that is devouring a little village with a church tower, a windmill, and a medieval shipwreck that was found at the very site where the container port is supposed to be developed further. This is a very interesting thing because also some kind of German ship. It's a Kogge, as you call it, a cog vessel. So it's a very important shipwreck from a heritage perspective. But you see the image that these campaigners paint of the port. It destroys everything that is nice and beautiful. So what I'm not going to do is to provide you with an overview that would be very boring of all the relevant environmental rules that affect port operations and port management. There will be very interesting speeches also when I go, and I'm very unhappy that I will have to miss these. But I selected 2 topics to discuss a bit further. And the first one is the impact of the European Bird and Habitat Directives on port management and port development. And the second one is the environmental rules contained in the brand new European Seaports Regulation, which is a piece of EU legislation dealing with port management. and it contains several provisions dealing specifically with environmental matters. So the first of my 2 chapters is about the European Bird and Habitat Directives. And we are talking here about something of huge importance. What you see here is the main container dock in Antwerp. It's called the Deurgang dock. And you see all the yellow boxes. It's the home terminal of the ship owner MSC, the yellow containers. Their main European hub is here in Antwerp, and this is today the biggest container terminal in Europe. And we have, I think, some 4 or 5 container terminals in Antwerp, but this is the biggest one. And it's a very nice one. It's very impressive to see, but there is one problem with this container terminal. As you can see on the photo, it is full. There is no space left. And the port is struggling to find an expansion. So this is really about the future of the port of Antwerp as the 2nd port in Europe. The logical solution would be to create a new dock. The photo you saw on the previous slides was this dock. This was before the terminal was in operation. This is the site of this big terminal. And the idea for, already you will find such a photo in my travel guide in 2007. So, because this was already then the plan. It was already considered urgent at that time, more than 10 years ago, to create a new dock, an even bigger one, which would be located here. But here I have to explain a bit what the problem is in terms of environmental law. Maybe I'll take a step here to show you. So the photo of the container terminal was this dock. And this is part of the left bank of the river. So this is the river that comes from the sea, the Scheldt River. And the city of Antwerp is here. And first the port developed on the right bank until it reached the border with Holland. So it could not be extended any further. So the port had to move to the other side of the river. And for that reason, back in the 70s, this area here, to the Dutch border, was reserved for future development of the port. So from a policy point of view, a very wise thing to do, to reserve an area for future development. But because of this, these docks were then constructed as from around 1970, but then we had an economic crisis, and also we had problems in finding a connection over Dutch territory for a ship canal. The original idea was to construct a big ship canal to the Scheldt this way, to allow deeper ships to enter that new port, but we had problems, as we always have, with our Dutch friends, so this didn't materialize. And for that reason, this area remained empty for a very long time. There were just docks, water areas, but no terminals, no factories, no new residential development, of course, because it was not allowed. It was reserved for future port development, so it was a wasteland. And the only creatures that were interested to go there were birds and animals and nice flowers. And in the 80s, then the Flemish government decided, on the advice of bird experts, to designate the same port development area as a bird zone under the European Birds Directive. And also several areas by the riverside were designated as habitats, protected habitats, under the European Habitats Directives. 2 important directives, European laws about nature conservation. So you see, we had here conflicting zoning, a port development area that at the same time got the legal status of a nature conservation area. And this is a problem that was created back in the 80s. No one at that time was aware. The Port Authority was not aware of what was going on. No one had any idea of the potential impact of this designation as a nature zone. But now we are still today, 2019, struggling with this problem. And we are trying to find a way to keep the port flourishing and growing. And we are talking here again about the future of the second biggest seaport in Europe. So this is again the existing dock and the intended new dock, bigger than the existing one. And this dock would be located, its mouth would be located here, right where there is a small village. It looks nice on the photo, but in fact, to be objective, it's not that special, such a special village. And it was then compulsorily acquired by the public authorities with a view to the construction of the dock. And today, only I think some 5 or 6 or maybe maximum 7 people live in that village. All the other houses are derelict, are empty. So this is some kind of ghost village today. And there's only some hardliners that continue to oppose the port development project that continue to live there. There is not one shop, there is not a school, there is nothing. Only some 4 or 5 or 6 people living there in that ghost village. And the village is located right here, where the new dock is supposed to be connected to the river. So to come to the present situation, this image, you see this is the existing container dock with the existing container terminal. Here the intention was to construct a huge new dock, bigger than this one. And now the compromise, the political compromise that the Flemish government is working on is to do something entirely different, to keep in place the uninhabited little village here and to construct a very strange mini dock, destroying part of the existing container terminal, creating an entrance here, and here a very, very small mini dock with maybe 2 or 3 berths for ships. The pilots are very worried because this is a very difficult river. It's even more difficult than the Elbe. How to bring a 400-meter container vessel, we have almost 6 meters tidal difference twice a day, strong currents, to bring that ship like this into that little dock. There will only be container facilities here on one side, because the other side will be a buffer zone to protect the village and the surrounding countryside. So, and this is, the risk is for the port that this is the only development that will be allowed in this huge area, which I showed you on the map before. So maybe this is good news for Hamburg, but it's not good news for Antwerp, for sure. So what is the reason why I decided to go into this? Because a long time ago, in 2006, it was my last book before I started on the travel guide. In 2006, I made a study for the European Commission. Okay, and the study, thank you. The study was for DG Move, it was not for DG Environment, so it was for the transport policy makers in the European Commission in Brussels, and they wanted to have an overview and an analysis of the impact of the birds and habitats directives on port policy and on waterways policy. And this was published as a book. I think it's out of print now, but anyway, it was in 2006, and I reached a number of conclusions, and I identified problems at the European scale, not just in Belgium. There was an insufficient integration of policies. You had environmental policy and a policy department in the Commission doing its job, and next to it, somewhere else, you had people dealing with transport policy, and they didn't talk to one another. They were not interested in what the other party was doing. There was a total lack of integration. I also tried to make an inventory in my study of all the problem files and the court cases and the delays and the cancellations of port and waterway related projects. And at that time, it was really huge. It was a terrible mess, we could say, at that time in the entire port and waterway sector. And there were many, many unsolved problems, and the most important one was a total lack of legal certainty. The bird and habitat directives are written in a quite vague manner. It's about principles, very general principles, about nature protection and procedures, how to decide on a new project, and so on. But the outcome, when campaigners went to court, the outcome was totally unpredictable. And authorities tried to find their way, but it was a mess. It was total uncertainty, also for investors, not only for authorities. This is just a list of 10 causes célèbres, so the 10 main cases that also gave rise to court judgments, also in Luxembourg, from the European Court of Justice. Also some in Germany. And the list is even longer, so I try to analyze all these problems. And I came to the conclusion that, in fact, most of all the problem cases relating to the implementation of the Birds and Habitat Directives related exactly to waterway and port projects, either new developments or even just maintenance dredging activities and things like that. I also noticed that the pre-existing status of ports and waterways was never taken into account when the nature directives were implemented. I showed you this zoning in Antwerp for future development, but there are other examples as well. For example, in relation to the river, our river access from Antwerp to the sea is the river Scheldt, which has its mouth in Holland, and the status and the freedom of navigation on that river is protected by fundamental treaties signed between Belgium and Holland. All this was never taken into account when it came to the implementation of the nature directives of Europe. So there was no integration between policies, and there was no integration, more specifically, with the trans-European networks policy of the European Union, which is the flag under which transport infrastructure is developed in Europe. What was also ignored was the inherent scarcity of port development areas. Of course, nature conservation areas are, by their very essence, scarce goods. No one will deny this. But also a potential port area is probably even scarcer, because a port must be located somewhere near a maritime access route, and also a port cannot be relocated. A bird can be relocated. For that purpose, it has wings. It can fly to another place. A quay wall or a container terminal cannot fly to another place. So the scarcity of a port area is even more urgent, so to say, or more extreme than a nature conservation area. But all this was ignored. There was this massive legal uncertainty. Court judgments, as I said before, were totally unpredictable. The directives, I should also point out, this is also the case with our problems in Antwerp today, these nature directives are very often used by people and groups who are not interested in nature conservation at all. They just use it, or rather their lawyers use it, or abuse it, one might say, to go to court and to make their point and to stop a project out of, not in my backyard, considerations, protecting very often their own private interests. And also in Antwerp, the authorities have been developing, in order to try to meet the requirements of the directives, to proactively develop artificial nature zones in that port area. But these projects are really hated by these campaigners. They are not interested in nature conservation, and they are even against it. But still, they use the legal weapon of the Birds and Habitat Directives to go to court and to stop the project. This is, of course, has never been the intention of the European legislator. The intention was to create a framework for nature conservation, which is, of course, a very legitimate thing to do and a very right and correct thing to do. But the instruments are used for other purposes. And also, finally, I came to the conclusion that there was and there is a very serious risk of distortion of competition between ports, especially because national authorities interpret and apply the European directives in different ways. And I also noticed this when I did the study, for example, in England. They give a different interpretation. which doesn't surprise us, of course, as far as the English are concerned. By the way, the reason why I have to run away is that tomorrow I will be speaking at an event in Antwerp about Brexit and the ports. So, okay. But I cannot make any prediction about that, I must say. So, what made me curious when I was invited to this conference is to know what happened after my study. What happened after 2006? And I am still working a bit on my paper. Hopefully you can still accept it for publication. And I am still analyzing a little bit what has happened in the meantime. There have been a number of new court cases. I think 3 Luxembourg cases were also about ports. There was one infringement case against Ireland. There was one very important case from a legal perspective about the maintenance dredging in the river Ems, leading to the important shipyard in Papenburg in Germany. And there was another case which went totally wrong for Belgium and the Port of Antwerp in 2015, exactly about this port development project in Antwerp. The European Commission, after my study and also in consultation with the sector organizations and the environmental NGOs, issued guidelines to clarify the Birds and Habitats directives in 2011. But I must say, this is a very general guideline, and it doesn't really, it's not really of concrete help when it comes to the main key legal interpretation problems. In terms of European transportation policy, a new regulation was adopted in 2013, creating a new framework for the development of the Trans-European Transport Network. It refers in many articles to compliance with environmental rules, but it doesn't really give a status, a specific status to port development areas. By the way, one of my recommendations, it was more a suggestion to open a debate in my study of 2006, was to create, next to the nature conservation areas, to create a legal status for future port development areas, for the reason that they are scarce goods. Like we did at national level in Antwerp, to create a protected zone for future port development areas. I raised this issue, and many people in the port sector liked this idea, others did not, especially the English again, they were against it because they don't like any rule coming from Brussels on whatever subject. So this didn't materialize, but in any event, today the new Trans-European Transport Network regulation doesn't really create any progress in solving these issues. And then finally, as you probably know, in 2016, the European Commission organized a so-called refit exercise, which is, in simple terms, an evaluation of the functioning of European legislation. And they did it in 2016 for the Birds and Habitats directives. And the environmental NGOs were, of course, very active in providing input. There were also some comments, some complaints sent to the European Commission in that context by waterway administrations and port authorities and ministries responsible for public works in member states, pointing out the lack of legal certainty created by the Birds and Habitats directives. But in the end, the European Commission decided that the Birds and Habitats directives are functioning perfectly well and that there is no reason whatsoever to consider any amendment of these directives. So as I am still working on my paper, I cannot give you my conclusions. I would rather call them at this stage impressions about the current situation. There has been made available some useful additional clarification by the European Court of Justice. There are, of course, very sincere efforts of many involved parties, public authorities and environmental NGOs and so on, to try to reconcile the legal frameworks and the objectives. But I think still this fitness check of the Birds and Habitats Directive was flawed because the the environmental administrations and the environmental NGOs, they always use the same excuse. When things go wrong or there is a court case stopping a project, they always have this excuse, you didn't read it correctly, you have to read it better. You don't understand the Birds and Habitats Directive. It's your own fault that it went wrong. And this is always the excuse. Of course, this is totally wrong because the inherent problem, the cause, is the lack of clarity in the directives themselves. That's the problem. Because as I explained in Antwerp also, the Port of Antwerp really did its best together with the Flemish government to proactively create, before the container dock was even started, to create new nature zones to try to avoid all problems. And everyone thought in Belgium that this was the right thing to do. And it was supported, albeit informally, by the European Commission, by the environmental officers of the European Commission. And still the court in Luxembourg, when these campaigners went to court, the court said, no, this is wrong because you were using a wrong paragraph in the Habitats Directive. So many people do their best, but it's so terribly difficult to do it in a legally robust way that will be supported by the courts. So in essence, the same problem of unpredictability is still there. For that reason, I am of the opinion that there is still a need for additional guidance on the interpretation. There is still this problem that people who are not interested in nature conservation at all try to abuse these directives. The risk of competitive distortions is still there, but also, and this is my final point, I think realistically we have to be aware that it is politically impossible to change the Birds and Habitats directives. We have seen this very clearly during the refit process of the European Commission. It is really a taboo subject. You cannot even, I know there were some European members of the European Parliament, when I did my study, there were some guys that, yes, I consider taking an initiative in the European Parliament to make some changes to the directives. And after a while, after having thought about it, they said, no, I don't dare to do this. I cannot do this. It's impossible. It's a taboo subject. So, but this is the reality is, I show you the photos, the reality is the future of very important ports is at stake. I don't know how much time I have left. I have no time left. Yeah, I will be very brief then on the second chapter, because this is about the environmental aspects of the new European Seaports Regulation, which is a new piece of European law that regulates how port authorities should grant access to services markets in a port. For example, how a towage provider can get the authorization to offer its services in a given port. This market access. And the second thing, there are provisions about port dues, port infrastructure charges, as it is called in the regulation, and also port service charges. I have made an inventory in these slides, just of an informative nature, of all the relevant environment-related provisions in the regulation. I think I don't have to explain all this because I left some leaflets downstairs of a new book of more than 1,000 pages in which I try to explain all the details about this new regulation. So if you're really interested, I can recommend the book, and maybe it's now time to allow the chair to ask for a few questions. I thank you in any way for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation and that very thought-provoking speech. You get a little present. All the others found already the present in their hotel rooms, all the other speakers. But since there is no hotel room for you, we do it that way. I welcome some very few questions, but there can only be very few questions since time is running. But we already got the first one, so if you please wait for the micro. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I was just wondering, last year or 2 years ago, we had a conference, and there was one of your Dutch friends from the port of Rotterdam, and he explained us very impressively how they did the extension in the Maasvlakte, and they had a very long planning process going on, involving a lot of communities, people trying to overcome these legal obstacles that you have presented here within the framework of the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive. Is maybe that also possible in your view, you know, that these, of course, restrictive regulatory frames can be, you know, just the frame for creative solutions which try to really balance out economic planning interests and environmental interest? Thanks.
Thank you, that's a very relevant point. Of course, our Dutch friends, they are masters in promoting and selling what they do. I can tell you, and maybe you saw it in one of my slides, one of the projects that also gave rise to very, very serious fundamental legal problems was a second Maasvlakte in Rotterdam. It was also stopped by the court, by a Dutch court, not by the Court of Justice in Europe, but by the Supreme Administrative Court in Holland. And then afterwards, they had to restart the whole process, like it happens so often in Europe, that projects are stopped and then the whole procedure has to start all over again. And of course, they made a deal, and the thing that authorities try to do more and more is to reach a deal with the opponents, to make them happy and to avoid them going to court again. But this is a very tricky thing, because now you saw this compromise proposal in Antwerp of the Flemish government with this tiny little mini dock, and this is accepted by the campaigners that campaign for the preservation of the village, because the village is preserved. And now the government thinks, okay, the problem is solved, we have a deal with the opponents, but no one can guarantee, of course, that there will be not one other, even individual, one single unique inhabitant who is still not happy and might go to court again. So this is a very tricky thing to do. Of course, it worked out in the end very well in Rotterdam, and they have a very nice facility there. We should be very jealous in Antwerp and in Hamburg about the second Maasvlakte, because it's really something that we don't have in our ports. It's such a huge new capacity. And, but in the end, it took a long time. They also did a lot of investment in nature projects and things like that, so they did it in a good way in the end, but they also had their problems.
Thank you very much. There is a second question by Nele Mats-Luc, and I'm afraid it's the last question due to time constraints, even though there might be never a Brexit, and so maybe you might not have to give the talk tomorrow in Antwerp. But since we want you to be very happy and to come back to Hamburg, we try to, respect your schedule. Please.
Yes, thank you for your provoking and thought-provoking talk. I would like to respond to one remark you made when you said, well, birds can fly, but ports cannot, which is of course true. And let me be clear, I fully agree that the Birds and Habitat Directive is outdated, that it should be revised, and it's a kind of a holy cow. I think it should be adapted and should be possible. We shouldn't have very old legislation that's no longer up to date, that cannot be changed. But if we say, well, ports are important, if you hear the single cases, and we had the same discussion here in Hamburg with some Wasserschierling, I don't know what, even some kind of plant, it helps if it's cute animals, but if it's just plants, people say, oh, look, a port must be much more important. But ports are important. Motorways are important. Cities are important. Renewable energy developments are important. Airports are important. So if you just look at single cases, the economic interest will always win, and that's precisely why we do have a Habitats Directive, be it outdated or not, a national legislation. So I just wonder, in your specific case, it makes perfect sense to say, oh, look, here port development maybe should have trumped over this village and the directive, but that would always be the case, and then actually we wouldn't need the Habitat Directive any longer.
That's an argument that I hear very often, but the thing is, in Antwerp, it's special. It's the second port of Europe. It had this huge future development area created back in the 70s with the intention of creating legal certainty for the port and for the customers and for the investors and for the political world as well. And all of a sudden, these environmental rules came in without any attempt at coordinating. And I don't really believe that it is correct to say that in the end the economy will always win. I think here in Antwerp, I think that the port will lose. The port will lose, and everyone in the port is aware that this mini dock is not what the port needs. And I think if we cannot expand this capacity, the containers will go to Rotterdam in the first place. This will create extra motorway traffic, because the containers will come anyway, and this will create an extra burden in terms of road pollution in our country, in Holland. Because also one of the advantages of Antwerp and of Hamburg is that these ports are so far inland, so the ships can arrive very close to the final destination, which mitigates the burden of road traffic. So from that point of view as well, it's very often better to have deep inland river ports. But of course, these campaigners, they only look from their own little perspective, and they don't see the broader picture very often. And I'm not sure that in the end the economy always wins. I think it's not going to be like that in this very case.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.